And now we're going to turn to Frank Gaffney, who is the founder and president of the Center for Security Policy, a man who's well known to most people on this show and on many shows, and a guy who has been for the last, how many years, Frank? 30 years?
24, I think. It seems like forever.
Has been sounding the alarm on a number of issues, but particularly something that he's talked about a lot is the threat of the Muslim Brotherhood. Who is the Muslim Brotherhood? They've been in Europe. Now they're coming to the United States. So you've got a new report out from the Center for Security Policy, and what are you concluding and warning us about with the Muslim Brotherhood in America?
KT, it's actually not a report as much as it's a course, we call it. It's a 10-part video that is available for free at a website, very memorable, I think, MuslimBrotherhoodInAmerica.com. And what it does is it walks you through basically what is motivating folks like the Muslim Brotherhood, an ideology, if you will, a doctrine that they call Sharia, a totalitarian, supremacist Islamic doctrine that compels them to engage in jihad in order to impose this doctrine, this Sharia, worldwide and establish, if they have their way, a caliph, a global ruler to govern in accordance with it. And then it walks you through how are they trying to wage that kind of jihad. In the previous segment, you've just been talking about, of course, the violent kind, people blowing up planes or flying planes into buildings or IEDs or what have you. But there's another element to this, KT, that I think really the course is principally focused on. And that's because we think very few other people are focused on it. And it's what the Muslim Brotherhood calls civilization jihad, by which they mean trying to advance exactly the same objectives that I just described, the global imposition of Sharia and a caliph to rule according to it, but through not so much nonviolent means as pre-violent ones. And we explore what those are and how advanced they are in our own country.
So what do you make, for example, of the trials that we're now having at Guantanamo for the KSM trials, the show trials, the mocking nature of the defendants and the way they seem to be really just making fun of the American legal system? Does this fit in with what you're talking about?
It does. You know, it's ironic. It's kind of the antithesis of a show trial, which typically means, you know, the government just goes through the motions. Here the government is actually trying to give these guys a fair trial, and they're using it for show. They're using it as part of the civilization jihad, yes, kind of an information warfare, information dominance, really, is what the military would call it, by getting us to kind of avert our gaze from who these guys are, what they're about, and most especially the extent to which they've actually gotten inside the wire. And I'm not so much speaking of the guys who are inside the wire, fortunately, at Guantanamo Bay, as much as they're inside the wire of our government and our civil society institutions. And again, we drill down. Part 2 of the course in particular explains how in, I don't know, our churches, in our schools, in our media, in our capital markets, as well as in the government itself, we've seen brotherhood organizations and operatives working influence operations against us. And so while, you know, KSM is kind of doing it on a grand stage at the moment, it's really the stealthy part of this that is much more worrying because A, we're not paying attention to it, and B, we're doing nothing to counter it.
Has what's happened in Europe with the Sharia courts in Great Britain, with the multiculturalism in a number of Northern European countries, is that sort of the preview of what we could expect in America today? And if you'd also go into certain detail about what has happened in Europe with multiculturalism.
Yeah. You know, it's a fascinating issue. I did a piece that I think you may have seen in the Washington Times yesterday. They put a wonderful cartoon together of a Frankenstein monster made out of all of these various countries. The truth of the matter is, we're watching, I think, the European experiment unravel. this project of creating a kind of superstate out of all of these countries. And in part, that's happening because, yes, they have adopted, in response to the declining birth rates of the native populations, many of these countries, a policy of just importing as many immigrants in as they can, the majority of whom, it's turned out, have been unassimilable Sharia-adherent Muslims. And those that aren't necessarily, when they get there, become, well, radicalized is the term that's used, but in a way it's really just mainstreamed into this doctrine of Islam. Not all Muslims, you know, adhere to Sharia, let me be clear, and those that don't, I think, aren't the problem, but those that do are, and those that become induced by being in ghettos in, you know, Europe, through the mechanisms like the courts and through other kinds of pressure to conform are almost certainly going to be the problem. And here's the real kicker, KT. Right now, just as one example, there are something on the order of 750 areas of France, just France, that are now considered to be no-go zones, in which these enclaves of immigrants are now basically not only following Sharia themselves, they're imposing it on the community and they're excluding the authorities. They dare not go into these areas. That's a sign of where Europe is now and where it's headed. And it's also, I think, an ominous indicator of where these guys would take us in Dearborn and in other communities around the United States if they have their way.
Talk to us about the political influence that these groups are having in Europe. We've just seen the elections in France. And in Greece, I think the European community as well has scheduled a number of elections throughout. A number of these countries are going to have elections going forward. Is the Muslim community in these countries a voting bloc? And if so, how is it voting? And have they affected what we've seen as a left turn in France?
Great question. I think it's working in two ways, actually. In France, yes, my sense of it is that they did block vote more or less monolithically, the Muslim immigrants in France, against Sarkozy and for Hollande. And in other parts of Europe, they have precipitated a kind of reaction, notably, you know, the Golden Dawn, for example, in Greece, which is a relatively small party, but it may well prove at 7% to have a disproportionate influence in whatever coalition emerges. That's an anti-immigrant party, some could say a fascistic neo-Nazi party, that is in part responding to a rising sentiment in Greece, and frankly it's happening elsewhere too, that something's dreadfully wrong, that these countries are no longer what they were. They've now, in the name of multiculturalism, actually submitted to this doctrine of Sharia. They've accommodated to the point where they're losing, you know, their integrity and perhaps their security as well.
What do you make of the trials that we're having, not only the trials that we're having in the United States, but the trials that we're having in the intelligence world? You know, we've been told that al-Qaeda is on its way out, that al-Qaeda's finished, bin Laden's dead, your leadership has been killed by drone strikes, and yet what we've seen is, in fact, al-Qaeda has changed. Al-Qaeda is back. Do you look at this as a clash of civilizations conflict? Do you see this as something that's going to go on for an awfully long time, as you're talking about it on various fronts, a military front, an international front, an academic front, a front in society? I mean, where do you see the al-Qaeda threat 10 years later?
Well, it's not the al-Qaeda threat is where I would start. Al-Qaeda is one subset of this universe of people who adhere to this threat doctrine of Sharia. Their particular angle on it is to right now. That's consistent, by the way, with Muhammad's teaching, is where you think you must use violence, jihad, to compel people to submit. The problem is that it's not just al-Qaeda. Certainly it's not just al-Qaeda core, as we've seen with the underwear bomber 2.0 in the recent days. Are these franchises of al-Qaeda. They're growing by leaps and bounds and becoming more deadly by the day. But my real concern, KT, is beyond the people who are sort of having us focus on that shiny dangling object of terrorism. You have this other whole dimension of jihad that is being promoted, being pursued by the Muslim Brotherhood, not just in Egypt, where we turned over a country and $1.5 billion, by the way, your tax dollars, to the Muslim Brotherhood's run government just recently, not just in Europe, not just in Latin America or East Asia, but here as well. And again, that's the focus of MuslimBrotherhoodInAmerica.com. And if we don't even understand that the kinds of jihadist end states or goals that we have every reason to fear are being advanced inexorably through these other stealthy, pre-violent techniques, we can't possibly counter, let alone defeat that threat. And that's what really I worry about most.
Okay, well, thank you so much for joining us and giving us a real education, just like the one people are going to get at the Center for Security Policy when they go look at your course on the Muslim Brotherhood. That's Frank Gaffney, President of the Center for Security Policy.